Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well and enjoying the channel's content. Did you know that 97% of viewers watch the videos without subscribing? If you're enjoying our thrilling and spooky stories, I kindly ask you to hit the subscribe button to support us and help us bring you more exciting tales. Thank you so much. Growing up along the coast of South Africa, I never paid much attention to folklore or urban legends. Sure, we had our share of ghost stories, and my grandfather occasionally regaled us with tales of paranormal encounters from his days working in the dockside warehouses. But creatures like Bigfoot or skinwalkers? Those were foreign concepts, belonging to distant lands and cultures. That all changed a few days ago. I'm writing this down now, while the memory is still fresh, though I doubt I could ever forget what I saw that night. It's seared into my brain, a haunting image that refuses to fade. I was on the cusp of finishing school, and my sister had returned home from university for a break. Our family decided to take a trip to a nearby coastal town, a place filled with fond memories of past Christmases and Easters. The drive was familiar, barely an hour long, a route we traveled countless times. It seemed impossible that anything out of the ordinary could happen on such a well-worn path. How wrong I was. We left later than usual that day, my dad's work keeping us until the early evening. Still, there was enough light as we set out, and we planned to reach our destination before full dark settled in. We went through our usual packing routine and had been on the road for about 20 minutes when the car suddenly shuddered violently. It felt as if we veered onto a dirt track, despite being on a paved highway. My dad quickly pulled over, bringing us to a stop on a stretch of long grass lining the road, bordered by a windbreak of trees. It didn't take long to discover the source of our trouble. The back tire had burst, nearly ripped entirely from the rim. Normally, this would have been a minor inconvenience, a quick change and we'd be on our way. But of course, things are never that simple when you least expect complications. Not only was the spare tire tucked away under the car, but it was also secured with a lock to prevent theft. Years of exposure to muddy roads and coastal moisture had taken their toll, rusting the lock so thoroughly that the key wouldn't even enter. After several frustrated attempts, my dad finally admitted defeat and called for roadside assistance. To add to my discomfort, I realized I was completely barefoot. The trip was supposed to be a simple point A to point B journey, both locations with relatively soft ground, so I hadn't bothered with even sandals. Now, with the car jacked up and unsafe to sit in, we all had to wait outside. The winter chill bit at my exposed toes, and every step brought the risk of thorns or sharp stones. My shoes, mockingly close yet inaccessible, were locked away in the boot. I was forced to play a miserable game of hopscotch, searching for clear patches of earth to stand on, effectively trapping myself in small, safe zones. By the time the tow truck arrived, the sun had fully set. The overcast sky hastened the arrival of darkness, and soon we were enveloped in the thick black of a moonless night. The surrounding farmland added its own eerie soundtrack, the occasional mournful lowing of distant cattle carried on the wind. I've always had a touch of nyctophobia, fear of the dark. It's a fear I paradoxically nurtured by constantly listening to horror podcasts or reading creepy stories while I work or game. I'm the type who loves horror but then lies awake for nights afterward, only to dive back in at the first opportunity. Standing there in the growing darkness, every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The mechanic, let's call him Greg, got to work on the stubborn lock. The sounds of his efforts, grunts of exertion, and the metallic clang of tools drifted up from beneath the car. For half an hour, he labored to free our spare tire, while the world around us faded into an impenetrable black. My parents and sister had wandered a few meters away, chatting with Greg's assistant. I, however, remained rooted to my little circle of safety near the car, unwilling to brave the unseen hazards of the grassy verge with my bare feet. Every passing car made me jump, the sudden rush of noise and light shattering the oppressive silence. Yet each vehicle also brought a moment of relief, its headlights briefly illuminating our surroundings, chasing away the imagined horrors lurking just beyond sight. It was during one of these fleeting moments of illumination that everything changed. Being as on edge as I was, I had fallen into a pattern of frantically scanning our surroundings whenever a car passed, reassuring myself that we were alone on this lonely stretch of highway. For the first few passes, there was nothing but grass and trees. But then, About 50 feet ahead of us stood a solitary tree, distinct from the others. It wasn't particularly tall, but it stood alone in the middle of the grassy strip rather than lining the edge like its fellows. As the next set of headlights swept across the scene, I felt my heart stutter to a stop. There, by that tree, something was looking back at me. I can barely bring myself to describe what I saw, but I must try. It had a face, if you can call it that, pale, almost luminously white in the brief flash of light. The eyes were sunken deep into the skull, black pits that seemed to draw in the surrounding darkness. Its torso was unnaturally elongated and thin, towering well above the height of an average man. But it was the face that held me transfixed. The nose was bizarrely elongated, reminiscent of an antelope's snout, yet disturbingly human at the same time. I caught a glimpse of a spindly, clawed hand gripping the tree trunk as it stared, unblinking, in our direction. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were telling it. As the car passed and darkness fell once more, I tried desperately to rationalize what I'd seen. It must have been a trick of the light, I told myself. An old, pale log that resembled a face. A jumble of branches that looked like a figure. Anything but what I knew, deep down, I had actually witnessed. When the next vehicle approached, its light sweeping across that spot once more, the figure was gone. That was my breaking point. Thorns and stones be damned, I bolted across the grass to where my family stood, inserting myself into the middle of their group. For the remainder of our time on the roadside, I was a bundle of raw nerves, every sense on high alert. The snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent me spinning, peering uselessly into the inky blackness. More than once, I caught the briefest glimmer of 2 pinpricks of light. Eyes? That vanished as soon as I focused on them. Shadows seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I tried to look directly at them. At random intervals, I'd find myself struggling to breathe, as if the very air had grown thick and resistant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention, my skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes boring into me from every direction. When my dad finished with the winch we'd been using, one of those multi-part assemblies, I snatched up one of the metal poles without a word of explanation. I clutched it like a weapon, knowing full well how pathetic a defense it would be against whatever was out there. But it granted me some small sense of security, and I didn't care about the odd looks my family gave me. I hadn't told them about what I'd seen. What would be the point? My dad would have laughed it off as an overactive imagination. My sister would have panicked, making the whole situation worse. And my mom, well, she'd probably insist we all pile back into the car, flat tire or no. After all, who would believe such an outlandish tale without seeing it for themselves? All I could do was wait, counting each agonizing second of the 2 hours we spent stranded on that lonely stretch of road. My fingers ached from their death grip on the metal bar, but I didn't dare loosen them for even a moment. After what felt like an eternity, Greg announced he'd finally freed the spare tire. I couldn't get into the back seat fast enough, practically diving through the door. It took another 10 minutes before we actually started moving, and as we pulled away, I forced myself to look one last time at the spot where I'd first seen the creature. My worst fears were confirmed. There were no white logs, no oddly shaped branches, no pale bushes. Nothing that could have been mistaken for what I'd seen. Whatever it was had been there, real and present, and had moved on when it realized it had been spotted. Trying desperately to push the image from my mind, I jammed my earphones in and cranked up my music to a nearly painful volume. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing sleep to come and grant me a temporary reprieve from the horror. It wasn't until we turned off that stretch of highway that I realized every muscle in my body had been tense to the point of trembling. Only then did I allow myself to relax, if only slightly. In the days since, I found myself obsessively researching local folklore and urban legends. But nothing I've found comes close to describing what I saw that night. The creatures I read about, the Tokalash, the Impundaloo, even the mermaid-like Mimlambo, bear no resemblance to the entity by the tree. Part of me wants to dig deeper, to put a name to the nameless terror I encountered. But another part, a wiser part perhaps, warns me against pursuing this knowledge. Some truths are better left uncovered. The summer heat lingered well into the evening as I made my way home from work. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks that reflected off the waves. It was a beautiful sight, one that usually filled me with a sense of peace and contentment. But lately, that feeling had been overshadowed by an inexplicable unease that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. I turned off the main road and into the residential area where my apartment building stood. The contrast between the idyllic beach town and this particular neighborhood was stark. While tourists flocked to our pristine beaches and quaint downtown area, they rarely ventured into this part of town. Here, the buildings were older, a bit run down, and there was an air of neglect that hung over everything like a thin layer of grime. My apartment building sat just behind a seedy motel, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and turned a blind eye to whatever went on behind closed doors. Local legend had it that a serial killer had once used the motel as a base of operations back in the 80s, supposedly keeping dismembered body parts in the bathtubs. I'd always dismissed it as an urban myth, the kind of story that gets passed around to scare tourists and newcomers. But on nights like this, with shadows stretching long across the pavement and an unseasonable chill in the air, it was all too easy to believe. Between the motel and our apartment building lay an abandoned lot we affectionately referred to as Murder Lot. It was an overgrown tangle of bushes and small trees, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence that had long since given up on actually keeping anyone out. The lot had become a haven for local wildlife and the occasional homeless person seeking shelter. During the day, it was just another eyesore in a neighborhood full of them. But at night, it took on a more sinister aspect. As I approached my building, I found my steps quickening involuntarily. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I glanced over at Murder Lot, my eyes straining to pierce the deepening gloom. Was that movement I saw among the bushes, or just shadows playing tricks on me? I shook my head, trying to dispel the paranoid thoughts. I was a 32-year-old woman, not some scared kid jumping at shadows. Still, I couldn't help but feel relieved when I finally reached the relative safety of my apartment building. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, where I shared a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate, Kitty, and her cat, Mr. Whiskers. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard a meow from inside. Mr. Whiskers was always the first to greet me, probably hoping for an early dinner. "I'm home," I called out as I entered, dropping my bag by the door and kicking off my shoes. Kitty's voice drifted from her bedroom. "Hey, how was work?" Same old," I replied, making my way to the kitchen to feed the insistent Mr. Whiskers. "You? Brutal," Katie groaned. "I swear, if one more tourist asks me where they can see celebrities, I'm going to scream." I laughed, some of the tension from my walk home dissipating. This was normal. This was safe. I pushed the unsettling feelings to the back of my mind and focused on the familiar routine of the evening. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, Kitty knocked on my door. "Hey, you want to try one of these?" she asked, holding up a small bag of gummy candies. I raised an eyebrow. "THC?" She nodded. "Just got them from my cousin. They're supposed to be really good for relaxation and sleep." I hesitated. I wasn't much of a cannabis user, but my body was aching from a long weekend of helping a friend move. "You know what? Why not?" I said, taking one of the gummies. "Thanks. Just take it easy," Kitty warned. "These can be pretty potent if you're not used to them." I nodded, popping the gummy into my mouth. It was sweet and tangy, with just a hint of an herbal aftertaste. I finished my nightly routine and crawled into bed, feeling the tension in my muscles start to ease as the THC began to take effect. That night, I dreamed of a skinwalker. In my dream, I was walking through Murder Lot, the overgrown vegetation seeming to reach out and grab at my clothes. The sky above was a sickly green color, and there was no sound except for my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something was circling me, just out of sight. I could hear it breathing now, a wet, raspy sound that sent chills down my spine. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The thing behind me was getting closer. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Just as I felt claws brush against my back, I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. Sunlight was streaming through my window, and I could hear Katie moving around in the kitchen. It had just been a dream, I told myself. A vivid, terrifying dream, but a dream nonetheless. I blamed it on the THC gummy and tried to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. The next few weeks passed without incident, and I started to forget about the unsettling dream. Work kept me busy, and in the evenings, I found myself spending more time with Katie, binge-watching shows and chatting about anything and everything. Then came the night that changed everything. Katie had gone out of town for a conference, leaving me alone in the apartment with Mr. Whiskers. I didn't mind. I'd always been comfortable with solitude. But as night fell, I found myself feeling inexplicably on edge. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus on the words. Every little noise made me jump. Mr. Whiskers seemed to sense my unease, staying close by my side instead of wandering off to sleep in his usual spots. Finally, around midnight, I decided to call it a night. Mr. Whiskers followed me into my bedroom, curling up at the foot of my bed. His presence was comforting, and I soon drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a loud, insistent beeping. Beep, beep, beep. It sounded like a smoke detector, and it seemed to be coming from right inside my room. I sat up, disoriented and sweating. The room felt unbearably hot, and for a moment, I was convinced the building must be on fire. But as quickly as it had started, the beeping stopped. Heart racing, I got out of bed and made my way to the living room, expecting to see smoke or flames. But when I looked out the window, everything seemed normal. No fire trucks, no panicked neighbors evacuating the building. What I did see, however, made me freeze in my tracks. There, sitting in the middle of the sidewalk, was a cat. But not just any cat. This one was pure white, almost glowing in the dim light of the street lamps. And it was staring directly at Murder Lot, as still as a statue. I'd never seen this cat before, and something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there, unmoving, watching the cat. It didn't blink, didn't twitch or whisker. Just stared at the overgrown lot with an intensity that was almost human. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down to see Mr. Whiskers, belly up, asking for pets. When I looked back up, the white cat was gone. I stayed at the window for a while longer, waiting to see if the strange cat would return. It didn't. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off, and I started to feel cold. Shivering, I made my way back to bed, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying the events of the night in my head. The phantom smoke alarm, the oppressive heat followed by bone-deep cold, the unnerving white cat. None of it made sense. As I left for work that morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chain-link fence around Murder Lot was bent near the ground, just enough for a cat, or a very thin person, to crawl under. I tried to rationalize it. The fence was old, it had probably been like that for a while and I just hadn't noticed. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was new, that something had forced its way in, or out, of the lot. The days that followed were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed by Murder Lot, I found myself scanning the overgrown bushes, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. Katie returned from her conference, and life seemed to return to normal. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her about what had happened. How could I explain it without sounding crazy? About a month after the incident with the white cat, I was getting ready to take a shower. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I let Katie know I'd be occupying the bathroom in case she needed to use it first. As usual, I left the door unlocked in case Mr. Whiskers needed to use his litter box. I was in the middle of washing my hair when I heard a knock. At first, I thought it was coming from the bathroom door. I pulled back the shower curtain and called out, "What's up?" "It's me," came the reply, in what sounded like a strange version of Katie's voice. I didn't think much of it at the time. Katie and I often use silly voices when talking to each other. Assuming Mr. Whiskers needed to come in, I opened the bathroom door, expecting to see him waiting. But there was nothing there. I stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping onto the floor, trying to process what had just happened. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling water. I closed the door, my mind racing. When I finished my shower and went back to the living room, I asked Katie if she had knocked on the bathroom door. She looked at me, confused. No, I've been sitting here the whole time. Why? I believed her. She was in the exact same position she had been in when I went to take my shower. But if it wasn't her, then who or what had I heard? That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, a horrifying thought occurred to me. What if the knock hadn't come from the bathroom door at all? What if it had come from the bathroom window? The window was too high for anyone to see in from the outside. It was at least 6.5 feet off the ground. But there was that narrow walkway that ran between our building and the one behind us, passing right by the bathroom window. I tried to dismiss the thought, but it lingered, feeding my growing sense of unease. Sleep was hard to come by that night, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and disembodied voices. The final incident happened about 2 weeks ago, and it was the one that shook me to my core. I was just settling into bed, exhausted after a long day at work, when I heard it. A voice shouting from somewhere outside my window. "Help me. Somebody please help me." The words sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about the voice, something not quite right. It sounded distressed, yes, but there was an underlying tone that set my nerves on edge. I lay there, listening. The words repeated, over and over, like a recording stuck on loop. And it seemed to be getting closer. Eventually, it sounded like it was coming from right at the street corner. I got up and looked out my window, half expecting to see someone in distress. But there was nothing. The street was empty. Yet the voice continued. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Lights came on in neighboring houses, and I saw people coming out to investigate. I debated what to do. Should I go out there? Should I call the police? In the end, I decided to call 911. I reported what I was hearing, a man's voice calling for help, but no visible sign of anyone in distress. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone to check it out. I stayed at the window, watching. The neighbors eventually went back inside, but I kept vigil. And that's when I saw it. In the far distance, under the glow of a street lamp, something moved. I couldn't make out any details, it was too far away, but something about the movement was wrong. It didn't move like a person should. Was it limping? Or was it something else entirely? That was enough for me. I closed my curtains, turned off my light, and tried to go to sleep. I kept my ears open for any further disturbances, but the night remained silent. In the 2 weeks since that night, nothing out of the ordinary has happened. But I can't shake the feeling that something is very, very wrong. The incidents replaying in my mind, the dream of the skinwalker, the phantom smoke alarm and the white cat, the strange knock on the bathroom door, and finally, the distressed voice in the night. I've lived in this town my whole life. I know it's just a sleepy beach community, more concerned with tourist season and surfing conditions than anything supernatural. The rational part of my brain tells me there's no way something like a skinwalker could exist here. But there's a small part of me, growing larger every day, that wonders. What if there is something out there, something that doesn't fit into our normal understanding of the world? What if it's been here all along, hiding in plain sight, in the abandoned lots and dark corners of our town? I find myself watching murder a lot more closely these days. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that seems to move on its own, sets my heart racing. I've started taking a longer route home, one that avoids passing directly by the lot. Katie has noticed my unease, but I can't bring myself to explain it to her. How could I, when I barely understand it myself? Sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in from the ocean and the world outside seems muffled and strange, I think I hear something moving in the lot. A soft rustling, the snap of a twig. And once, just once, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the streetlight, watching me from the depths of the overgrown bushes. I tell myself it's just my imagination, fueled by lack of sleep and too many late-night horror movies. But deep down, I'm not so sure. There's a tension in the air, a feeling that something is building, coming to a head. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it is, it's watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. For now, life goes on. I go to work, I come home, I watch TV with Katie and play with Mr. Whiskers. But always, there's that undercurrent of unease. That feeling that something is not quite right in our sleepy little beach town. The relentless Arizona sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert bathed in an eerie twilight. I found myself driving down a lonely stretch of highway, the landscape around me a sea of scrub brush and towering saguaro cacti. My destination was a small ranch on the outskirts of the Navajo Nation, where I'd been hired to help with some maintenance work. As I drove, the radio crackled with static, occasionally catching snippets of local stations. One particular broadcast caught my attention, a somber-voiced announcer speaking in Navajo. Though I couldn't understand the words, the tone sent a chill down my spine. I switched off the radio, preferring the silence to the ominous broadcast. The darkness deepened as I turned onto a dirt road, my headlights cutting through the gloom. In the distance, I could make out the faint outline of mountains against the star-studded sky. The isolation was palpable, pressing on me from all sides. After what seemed like hours, I finally spotted the weathered wooden sign marking the entrance to the ranch. As I pulled up to the main house, an old pickup truck rumbled to a stop beside me. A grizzled man in his 60s climbed out, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of a lifetime under the harsh desert sun. "You must be the new hand," he said, his voice gravelly. "Name's Duncan. Welcome to the edge of nowhere." I introduced myself, shaking his calloused hand. Duncan gave me a quick tour of the property, pointing out the bunkhouse where I'd be staying and running through my duties for the coming weeks. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the brush made me jump. Duncan must have noticed my unease. "First time in these parts?" he asked, a knowing look in his eyes. I nodded, embarrassed by my jumpiness. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "The desert has a way of getting under your skin, especially at night. You'll get used to it, or you won't." With that cryptic statement, he bid me good night and headed back to the main house. I made my way to the bunkhouse, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the desert night kept me on edge, the mournful howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the creosote bushes, and other, less identifiable noises that set my imagination racing. Just as I was finally drifting off, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. It came again, closer this time, a sound that was almost, but not quite, human. I scrambled out of bed and peered out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the corral. A trick of the light, surely. But then I saw it again, a dark figure, hunched and misshapen, slinking between the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned, and for a split second, I swore I saw eyes gleaming in the darkness, eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. Then it was gone, vanishing into the night as if it had never been there at all. I must have made some sound of distress, because moments later, there was a pounding on the bunkhouse door. I opened it to find Duncan standing there, shotgun in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness behind me. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, unable to find my voice. Duncan's face grew grim. "Come with me. There's something you need to know." He led me back to the main house, where we sat at his kitchen table. Duncan poured us each a generous measure of whiskey, and as the fiery liquid burned its way down my throat, he began to speak. "What you saw out there, it wasn't natural. The Navajo have a name for it, skinwalker. A witch that can take the form of animals, or something in between man and beast. Most folks think it's just stories, but out here, we know better." I listened, my skepticism warring with what I'd seen with my own eyes. Duncan went on to explain the history of the land, how it had been the site of ancient battles and dark rituals. He spoke of other ranch hands who had fled in the night, of livestock found mutilated in ways that defied explanation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duncan's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of determination and fear in them. "Because you're here now. And once you've seen it, you're part of this. The skinwalker, it knows you've seen it. It'll be watching you now." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave right then, to drive until this godforsaken place was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. But something held me back, a sense of obligation, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity to uncover the truth behind these legends. The next few days passed in a haze of nervous tension. I threw myself into my work, repairing fences and tending to the livestock. Duncan kept a watchful eye on me, always nearby with his shotgun close at hand. At night, I lay awake, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. Sometimes, I thought I heard whispers on the wind, words in a language I didn't understand. Other times, I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision, gone when I turned to look. It was on the 5th night that things came to a head. I was out checking on the horses. They'd been skittish all day, refusing to graze in the far pasture. As I approached the barn, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the same inhuman scream I'd heard that first night. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I knew I couldn't leave the horses. Swallowing my fear, I edged closer to the barn door, my flashlight beam wavering in my shaking hand. The interior of the barn was pitch black, the darkness seeming to swallow my feeble light. I could hear the horses whinnying in distress, stamping their hooves against the stalls. And then, from the shadows at the back of the barn, I saw them, two gleaming eyes, reflecting my flashlight with an unnatural, reddish glow. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The figure emerged from the darkness, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was as Duncan had described, not quite human, not quite animal. Its body was covered in matted fur, its face a twisted parody of a coyote's muzzle. But its eyes were terribly, unmistakably human. The skinwalker let out another bone-chilling cry, and I turned to run. But I'd only taken a few steps when I felt something grab my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. I rolled onto my back, kicking frantically as the creature loomed over me. Just as I thought it was all over, a deafening boom split the air. The skinwalker reeled back, howling in pain and fury. Duncan stood in the barn doorway, his shotgun smoking. "Run," he shouted, pumping the shotgun for another round. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear the sounds of struggle behind me, punctuated by more gunshots and those terrible, inhuman screams. I made it to the house, slamming the door behind me and fumbling for the locks. For what seemed like an eternity, I huddled there, listening to the chaos outside. And then, suddenly, silence fell. It was dawn before I dared to venture out. I found Duncan sitting on the porch, his shotgun across his knees. He looked exhausted, with a nasty gash across his forehead, but he was alive. Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Duncan shook his head slowly. "It's never over. Not really. We drove it off for now, but it'll be back. It always comes back." In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could leave, try to forget everything I'd seen and experienced. Or I could stay, help Duncan defend this land against a threat most people would never believe existed. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, I made my decision. This place, this fight, it was part of me now. For better or worse, I was in it for the long haul. The years that followed were a constant struggle. We fortified the ranch, using a combination of modern security measures and ancient Navajo protective rituals. I learned everything I could about skinwalkers and other creatures that lurked in the shadows of the desert night. There were more encounters over the years, each one leaving its mark on us. We lost good horses, good men. But we held our ground, becoming the guardians of a secret war that raged just beyond the edges of the modern world. Now, As I sit on that same porch, my own shotgun across my knees, I think back to that first terrifying night. The young man I was then seems like a stranger to me now. I've seen things that would break most people, faced horrors that defy explanation. But I've also found a purpose, a calling greater than myself. The sun is setting, painting the desert in shades of purple and red. Soon, the night will come, bringing with it the ancient terrors that have always lurked in the darkness. But we'll be ready. We'll stand our ground, as we always have. For we are the watchers on the threshold, the guardians of the boundary between the world of man and the realm of nightmares. And as long as we draw breath, we'll continue to protect this land and its people from the darkness that lurks just beyond the firelight. The fog hung thick and heavy over Highway 202 as I made my way to work in the early hours of the morning. It was just past 4:30 a.m., and the world around me seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, caught between night and day. The rain from the previous evening had left everything damp and glistening, adding to the ethereal quality of the scene. I had been working as a kennel technician at the local animal control facility for several months now, and the early morning commute had become a familiar routine. The job was demanding, often emotionally taxing, but there was a sense of purpose in caring for the animals that made it worthwhile. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this particular morning. As I navigated the winding road, my headlights barely penetrating the dense mist, I found myself thinking about the strange occurrences I'd experienced since taking this job. It wasn't just the long hours or the sometimes heartbreaking nature of the work, there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The construction on Highway 202 was a constant presence, with lanes frequently blocked off and detours a common occurrence. I had learned to leave extra time for my commute, preferring to arrive early rather than risk being late. The shelter was always bustling with activity, and my days were invariably packed from the moment I stepped through the door. As I approached a particularly dense patch of fog, a massive orange sign loomed into view, marking the beginning of yet another construction zone. I eased off the accelerator, peering intently through the windshield. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a silhouette, a dark shape moving in front of the glowing sign. I slowed down even more, wondering if construction had started earlier than usual. But as I drew closer, details began to emerge that sent a chill down my spine. The figure was clearly feminine, dressed in what appeared to be a black lace dress. She held a matching umbrella, though the rain had long since stopped. Her blonde hair caught the light from the sign, creating a halo effect around her head. But it was her face, or rather, the lack of it, that truly unnerved me. A mourning veil obscured her features, lending her an air of mystery and sorrow. As I watched, transfixed, I realized that she wasn't walking so much as gliding through the mist. Her movements were too smooth, too ethereal to be human. And then I noticed her legs, or rather, the absence of them. Below the hem of her dress, her form simply faded into the fog, as if she were part of it. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps she was an eccentric local resident out for an early morning walk. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. There were no homes nearby, no funeral parlors or cemeteries for miles. And who would be walking along a highway at this hour, dressed for a funeral? As my car drew parallel to the sign, I turned my head to keep her in view. In that instant, she vanished. One moment she was there, gliding alongside the road, and the next she had simply ceased to exist. I blinked hard, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But the space where she had been remained stubbornly empty. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I eased my foot off the brake, allowing the car to creep forward, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Part of me wanted to pull over, to go back and search for some sign of the woman. But a deeper, more primal part of my brain was screaming at me to keep driving, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I found a safe spot to turn around and slowly made my way back to the construction sign. The fog seemed to have thickened in the few minutes since I passed, and I had to strain to see anything beyond the reach of my headlights. I drove past the sign once, twice, 3 times, each pass slower than the last. But there was no sign of the woman in black. No footprints in the damp earth by the roadside, no flutter of lace in the mist. It was as if she had never existed at all. Shaken, I resumed my journey to work, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I really seen a ghost? Was I more tired than I'd realized, my brain conjuring images out of the fog and shadows? Or was there something more to this stretch of road, something that most people never noticed as they sped by in the light of day? My musings were interrupted as I turned onto the road leading to the animal shelter. Traffic had come to a complete standstill, a sea of red brake lights stretching out before me. I groaned, realizing I was going to be late despite my early start. For the next hour and a half, I inched forward, covering less than a mile. The fog, combined with the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, made it nearly impossible to see what was happening ahead. Frustration warred with curiosity as I craned my neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the cause of the delay. Finally, as I neared the point where traffic was being redirected, I saw it. A motorcycle, or what was left of one, had been pulled to the side of the road. My stomach clenched as I took in the scene. A sheet-draped gurney was being loaded into an ambulance, the pristine white fabric marred by spreading crimson stains. Even through the fog, the sight was unmistakable. A large truck was parked nearby, its front end crumpled and askew. A group of people, police officers, paramedics, and what I assumed were witnesses, huddled around it, their voices alone murmured beneath the wail of sirens and the rhythmic clicking of emergency flashers. As I was waved through the detour, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The woman in black, the accident, were they connected? Had she been some kind of harbinger, a warning of the tragedy to come? Or was it all just a bizarre coincidence, the kind of thing that happens when lack of sleep meets an overactive imagination? I arrived at work nearly 2 hours late, my mind still whirling with the morning's events. The shelter was already bustling with activity, dogs barking, cats meowing, and my coworkers rushing about with their usual efficiency. I threw myself into my tasks, hoping the familiar routine would help settle my nerves. It wasn't until my lunch break that I heard the full story of the accident. A fellow kennel tech had heard it from one of the animal control officers who'd been called to the scene. The motorcyclist had collided head-on with the truck, dying instantly. The truck driver was physically unharmed but hysterical, claiming he'd swerved to avoid hitting a woman standing in the road, a woman who vanished into thin air. The story sent a fresh wave of goosebumps across my skin. I wanted to speak up, to share what I'd seen, but something held me back. Who would believe me? And what good would it do now, with the motorcyclist already gone? As the day wore on, I found my thoughts continually drifting back to the woman in black. Had she been there to guide the motorcyclist's soul? Was she a warning that went unheeded, or simply a lost spirit herself, wandering the foggy highway? It wasn't the first time I'd encountered something I couldn't explain at this job. The animal shelter itself seemed to be a magnet for the unexplained. More than once, I'd caught glimpses of dogs that I knew had been euthanized, their spectral forms darting between kennels or peering around corners. Cats would appear in my peripheral vision, only to vanish when I turned for a better look. Even more unsettling were the human shapes I sometimes saw, dark silhouettes moving between the rows of cages, crouching down to peer at excited dogs, or standing motionless in empty hallways. My coworkers rarely mentioned these occurrences, but the knowing looks we sometimes exchanged told me I wasn't alone in my experiences. One particularly memorable incident occurred late one night while I was working an overnight shift. The shelter was quiet, most of the animals sleeping, when I heard the distinct sound of a dog's nails clicking on the concrete floor. Thinking one of our charges had somehow escaped its kennel, I went to investigate. What I found instead was a large, black dog standing in the middle of the hallway. Its coat was glossy, its eyes bright and alert, not at all like the often bedraggled strays we typically housed. As I approached, calling out softly, the dog turned and trotted away, disappearing around a corner. I followed, my heart racing, but when I rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. I searched every kennel, every nook and cranny of the shelter, but found no sign of the mysterious dog. When I described the incident to my supervisor the next day, she grew pale and quiet. It wasn't until weeks later that she confided in me, sharing a photo of her childhood dog, a large, black lab who had passed away years ago, but who she sometimes felt was still watching over the shelter. These experiences, while unsettling, had become a sort of background noise to my daily life at the shelter. But the woman on the highway was different. She felt more immediate, more purposeful somehow. And the accident that followed her appearance, it was hard to chalk that up to mere coincidence. As my shift came to an end and I prepared to make the drive home, I found myself filled with a mix of dread and anticipation. Would she be there again, standing vigil by the construction sign? Part of me hoped so, longing for confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Another part prayed I'd seen nothing but empty road and dissipating fog. The drive home was uneventful, the construction sign standing silent and unremarkable in the fading afternoon light. I found myself slowing as I passed it, my eyes scanning the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the spectral woman. Days passed, then weeks, and life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as life can be when you work in a place that seems to straddle the line between the world of the living and something else. I never saw the woman in black again, but her memory lingered, coloring my perceptions of the world around me. I began to pay more attention to the stories my coworkers shared in hushed voices during slow periods at the shelter. Tales of animals that seemed to know when their time had come, lying peacefully in their kennels as if waiting for something only they could see. Accounts of inexplicable noises in the night, the jingle of collar tags in empty rooms, the soft thud of paws on floors that should have been vacant. One story in particular stuck with me. A longtime volunteer spoke of a night when she'd been working late, filing paperwork in the office. She'd heard a commotion in the cat room and gone to investigate, expecting to find a feline escapee making mischief. Instead, she found all the cats alert and attentive, their eyes fixed on a point in the center of the room. There, she swore, she saw the faint outline of a woman, her form translucent and shimmering. The apparition seemed to be petting each cat in turn, moving from cage to cage with slow, gentle movements. The volunteer, frozen in shock, watched for several minutes before the figure slowly faded away. In the days that followed, she noticed that the cats who had been in that room that night seemed calmer, more at peace. Several were adopted within the week, finding their forever homes after months in the shelter. As time went on, I found myself becoming more attuned to the subtle signs of the unexplained. It wasn't just the big, dramatic events like the woman on the highway. It was the little things, the way certain animals would sometimes stare intently at empty spaces, or how the atmosphere in a room could shift suddenly, filling with a sense of peace or unease for no apparent reason. I began to see my job differently, too. It wasn't just about caring for the physical needs of the animals in our charge. In some way I couldn't quite articulate, I felt like we were guardians of a threshold, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the bonds between humans and animals extended beyond the boundaries of life and death. This new perspective brought both comfort and responsibility. On difficult days, when the reality of working in animal control became almost too much to bear, I found solace in the idea that our work had meaning beyond what we could see or measure. And on good days, when a long-term resident finally found their forever home, I couldn't help but wonder if we had a little help from the other side. As the months passed, I developed a sort of sixth sense about the animals in our care. I could often tell which ones were close to the end of their journey, not just by their physical condition, but by a certain look in their eyes, a peacefulness that seemed to come over them. In those moments, I'd spend extra time with them, talking softly and offering gentle pets, feeling in some inexplicable way that I was helping to ease their transition. One night, as I was locking up after a late shift, I had an experience that would stay with me for years to come. I was doing a final walkthrough of the dog kennels when I noticed a soft, warm light emanating from one of the cages. Inside was an old German shepherd, a stray we picked up a few days earlier. The dog was clearly in his twilight years, his muzzle gray and his movements stiff and pained. As I approached the kennel, I saw that the light seemed to be coming from within the dog himself, a gentle glow that pulsed in time with his breathing. And there, sitting beside him with a hand resting on his graying head, was a figure I can only describe as radiant. It wasn't the woman in black from the highway, nor was it anyone I recognized. The figure was indistinct, more a suggestion of form than a solid presence, but the sense of peace and love emanating from it was palpable. I stood transfixed, hardly daring to breathe, as the figure turned towards me. There was no face that I could discern, but I felt a wave of understanding and compassion wash over me. In that moment, I knew with certainty that I was witnessing something profound, a soul being guided onwards, a faithful companion being welcomed to whatever comes next. The figure nodded once, as if acknowledging my presence, then slowly faded away. The warm light lingered for a moment longer before it too disappeared, leaving behind only the dim fluorescence of the kennel. The old German shepherd exhaled softly, his eyes closing for the last time. When I checked on him, his body was already growing cold, but there was a peacefulness to his expression that brought tears to my eyes. That night changed me in ways I'm still coming to understand. It reinforced my belief that there's more to our world and to our relationships with animals than what we can see or touch. It also deepened my commitment to the work we do at the shelter, knowing that we're not just caring for animals, but potentially helping to shepherd souls. As time went on, I found myself becoming something of an unofficial counselor for my coworkers, a person they could turn to when they experienced something they couldn't explain. I never claimed to have all the answers, but I could offer an open mind and a sympathetic ear. Together, we navigated the strange, sometimes unsettling, but often beautiful experiences that came with working in a place like our shelter. I've since moved on from that job, my life taking me in new directions. But the experiences I had there, the things I saw and felt, have stayed with me. They've shaped my understanding of the world, of the bonds we share with animals, and of the mysteries that surround us every day. Sometimes, when I'm driving down a foggy road in the early morning hours, I find myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see a figure in black lace emerging from the mist. I haven't seen her again, but in a way, I feel like I carry a part of her with me, a reminder to stay alert, to look beyond the surface of things, and to approach the unexplained with an open heart and mind. As I sat on my back porch, sipping in another glass of Crown Royal, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had taken a turn into the surreal. The cool night air did little to calm my nerves as I replayed the events of the past few days in my mind. It all started on what should have been just another mundane Monday. I'm in my early 40s, recently divorced, with 3 kids who split their time between me and their mother. This week, they were with her, leaving me alone in a house that felt cavernous and empty. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of how much my life had changed. Work that day had been frustrating, to say the least. My crew and I were building a house, currently in the framing stage, and we'd fallen behind schedule. The scorching heat didn't help matters, sapping everyone's energy and motivation. Usually, I would have opted for shorter days in weather like this, but our deadline loomed over us like a storm cloud. So, there I was, working until dark, long after my crew had gone home. By the time I got home that night, it was nearly 10:30. Exhausted, I took a quick shower, wolfed down some leftovers, and collapsed into bed. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't peaceful. Around 3 o'clock or 3:30 in the morning, I was jolted awake by an unsettling presence. In the doorway of my bedroom stood what I can only describe as a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness. It wasn't transparent, it had substance, a solidity that sent chills down my spine. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I tried to get up, ready to confront the intruder, but before I could move, the shadow was on top of me. It happened so fast, I couldn't process what was happening. One moment it was in the doorway, the next it was pinning me to the bed. I could feel its weight on my legs, its appendages holding down my arms. Now, I'm not a small guy. Years of construction work and powerlifting have left me in great shape. But no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't budge. It was like trying to lift a house with my bare hands. Just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, my body drenched in cold sweat. Had that really happened? Or was it just a vivid nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion? I told myself it must have been a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those invisible hands holding me down. Needing to calm my nerves, I went downstairs for a drink. The house was quiet, everything in its place. No signs of an intruder. After about half an hour, I managed to convince myself it was just a bad dream and headed back to bed. The next day at work was a carbon copy of the one before. We fell even further behind schedule. In a desperate attempt to make up time, I suggested changing to a 4 a.m. to noon schedule for the rest of the week to beat the heat. My crew, usually reliable and hardworking, showed no interest. Looking back, I should have recognized the toll the heat was taking and shut down for the week. Instead, I stayed late again, working alone until 10:30. That night followed the same pattern as before: a quick shower, a hastily eaten dinner, and then bed. The previous night's experience was pushed to the back of my mind, filed away as nothing more than a stress-induced nightmare. But at around 3:30 a.m., I was once again awakened by that same dark presence. The shadow stood in the doorway, blacker than black, a void in the shape of a person. Before I could even think to move, it was on top of me again. This time, it sat on my abdomen, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I fought with everything I had, every muscle in my body straining against this invisible force. But it was like trying to lift a mountain. I couldn't move an inch. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't breathe. My chest burned, my vision began to blur. Just as I thought I was about to lose consciousness, it vanished. Gasping for air, I stumbled out of bed and onto the back deck. This time, I couldn't shake it off as easily. My hands trembled as I poured myself a generous glass of Crown Royal, then another and another. Even as I tried to rationalize it as another nightmare, a part of me knew this was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the night on the deck, watching the sky slowly lighten, dreading the day ahead. Work was more of the same: frustration, delays, and the relentless heat. By 9 p.m., I was done. Not just for the day, but done in a deeper sense. I could feel myself burning out, my reserves depleted. To add to my stress, I had another day in family court scheduled for the next morning. My ex-wife was after more money, again. It felt like a never-ending cycle of legal battles and financial drain. That night, despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of work, money, and those terrifying nighttime encounters. When I finally drifted off around 1 a.m., my sleep was fitful and shallow. At 3:30 a.m., right on cue, I was torn from sleep by the shadow's presence. This time, it didn't wait in the doorway. It was instantly on my chest, its weight crushing me, cutting off my air supply. I struggled to breathe as it leaned in close, its face mere inches from mine. I found myself staring into what seemed like empty eye sockets, bottomless pits of darkness. The smell that emanated from it was indescribable, a mixture of decay and something alien, something that didn't belong in this world. Its breath felt cold on my face as it spoke in a low, rumbling voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're mine," it said. Those two words filled me with a terror I had never known. Just as the edges of my vision began to darken, as I felt myself slipping away, it vanished. I spent the rest of the night in an all-night diner, cup after cup of coffee, doing little to stop my hands from shaking. The waitress kept giving me concerned looks, probably thinking I was coming down from something. In a way, I suppose I was. Court that day was a disaster. My ex-wife's lawyer was particularly vicious, twisting every word I said. He managed to convince the judge that the nights and weekends I spent helping friends with their home projects or working on cars were actually under-the-table jobs. Despite my protests, despite the fact that I had all my payments up to date, I walked out of that courtroom owing an additional $10,000. The injustice of it all burned in my gut. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make someone understand what I was going through. But I knew that would only make things worse. So I swallowed my anger and headed to the gym, hoping to work out some of my frustrations. It didn't help. Every rep, every set just seemed to fuel my anger rather than dissipate it. By the time I left, I felt wound even tighter, like a spring ready to snap. Against my better judgment, I decided to swing by the job site to see how things had gone in my absence. I shouldn't have bothered. The owner was there, and he immediately laid into me about my crew leaving at noon. I couldn't blame him for being angry, but in that moment, it took every ounce of self-control not to lash out. I just stood there, apologizing over and over, feeling my grip on my emotions slipping with each word. On the way home, I stopped at the local liquor store and bought another bottle of Crown Royal. The events of the past few days, the nightmarish encounters, the stress at work, the disastrous court appearance had all but driven thoughts of the shadow creature from my mind. All I wanted was to numb myself, to find some respite from the constant barrage of stress and fear. Dinner that night was liquid courage, straight from the bottle. I drank with purpose, hoping to drown out the voice in my head that kept replaying every failure, every setback. It was probably a good thing I'd only bought a 26-ounce bottle. Even so, by the time I stumbled to bed, the room was spinning. I tossed and turned, alcohol and anger warring in my system. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and shallow. I drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully asleep but never quite awake either. At around 3:30 a.m., I became aware of a familiar presence. Through bleary eyes, I saw the dark mass forming in my bedroom doorway. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the cumulative stress of the past few days, or maybe something in me had finally snapped. Whatever the reason, instead of fear, I felt rage. Without thinking, I launched myself out of bed, screaming, "Not tonight, you asshole." I charged across the room, aiming for where I thought the entity was. Instead, I slammed full force into the door jamb, nearly knocking myself unconscious. I crumpled to the floor, my head throbbing, stars dancing in my vision. For a moment, I just lay there, waiting for the shadow to descend on me, to finish what it had started nights ago. But nothing happened. Slowly, carefully, I picked myself up off the floor. The room was empty. No shadow, no presence, no feeling of being watched. Just me, standing alone in my bedroom, with what would likely be a spectacular bruise forming on my forehead. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat on my bed, back against the headboard, watching the door. But the shadow never reappeared. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through my window, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had been my constant companion for the past few days began to dissipate, replaced by a grim determination. I didn't know what that thing was, or if it would come back, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Over the next few weeks, I made some changes. I cut back on my hours at work, realizing that running myself into the ground wasn't helping anyone. I started seeing a therapist to deal with the stress of the divorce and custody arrangements. I even began exploring meditation and stress reduction techniques. The shadow never returned. Sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, I still find myself tensing up, half expecting to see that dark form in my doorway. But it never comes. I don't know what those encounters were. Maybe they were stress-induced hallucinations, maybe they were something more. What I do know is that they forced me to confront the ways I had been neglecting my mental and emotional health. In a strange way, those terrifying nights became a turning point in my life. Today, things are better. Not perfect, but better. My relationship with my kids has improved now that I'm not constantly exhausted and stressed. Work is going well. I've learned to set better boundaries and manage my time more effectively. I'm even on better terms with my ex-wife, though I still keep a wary eye on her lawyer. As for the shadow, well, I still don't have an explanation for what happened those nights. Sometimes I wonder if it was real, or if it was just a manifestation of all the stress and fear I had been carrying. Other times, I'm certain it was something beyond my understanding, some entity that preys on the vulnerable and afraid. Either way, I'm grateful for the wake-up call it provided. It taught me that sometimes, the scariest things we face aren't supernatural at all. They're the day-to-day stresses that we allow to build up until they become monstrous, looming over us in the dark of night. Now, when I find myself lying awake at 3:30 a.m., instead of fearing what might be lurking in the shadows, I take a deep breath and remind myself that I'm stronger than I think. That I've faced down my demons, both real and imagined, and come out the other side. It was the summer of 2010, and I was 18 years old, living in a small border town in Arizona. As a high school senior on the cusp of graduation, I was filled with excitement about my future. I had enlisted to join the Army that summer, eager to serve my country and embark on a new chapter in my life. But before all that, I had to navigate the final weeks of high school and my part-time job at the local movie theater. Our family had moved into our current home about 2 years prior. It was a modest house, nothing extraordinary, but it was home. Being the oldest of my siblings, I had the privilege of having my own room. It wasn't much, but it was my space. My bed was positioned next to the door, with a TV sitting opposite, in front of a large window that looked out onto the street. The window was covered with long, white vertical blinds, the kind that swayed gently at the slightest breeze. Life was pretty normal back then. I worked nights and weekends at the movie theater, and like any teenager, I enjoyed hanging out with my friends after work or on my days off. We weren't troublemakers by any means, just kids making memories before we all went our separate ways after graduation. This often meant late nights, which didn't exactly align with my school schedule. My dad, bless him, took it upon himself to make sure I got up for school each morning, often resorting to knocking incessantly on my door or even sprinkling water on my face. I hated it at the time, but looking back, I'm grateful for his persistence. It was during one of these late nights that things began to change. I was tossing and turning in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. My closet door, which I distinctly remembered closing before bed, was slowly creeping open. It wasn't dramatic or noisy, just a slight, almost imperceptible movement. I brushed it off, figuring I must not have closed it properly. As I continued to lie there, trying to will myself to sleep, I felt a light tap on my right foot's big toe. It was so faint that at first, I thought I had imagined it. I sat up, peering around the darkened room, half expecting to see one of my brothers playing a prank. But the room was empty, and my door was still locked, as it always was. I got up, turned on the lights, and did a thorough check of my room and closet. Nothing. Shaking my head, I crawled back into bed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The next morning, I confronted my brothers, asking if they had been in my room during the night. They all denied it, looking genuinely confused by my accusation. I warned them to stay out of my room, but deep down, I knew they were telling the truth. They knew better than to invade my personal space. That night, I made sure to double-check everything before bed. I locked my door, ensured my closet was securely shut, and even did a quick sweep of the room to make sure my brothers hadn't somehow snuck in. Satisfied, I settled in to watch some TV before sleep. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of my TV turning off. The sudden silence was jarring. I got up, turned on the lights, and switched the TV back on, puzzled but not overly concerned. However, later that night, it happened again. The familiar click of the old box TV shutting off pulled me from my sleep. This time, when I opened my eyes, I saw my closet door standing ajar once more. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was settling, causing the door to swing open. Maybe there was a problem with the TV's timer. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't add up. Frustrated and a little scared, I tried to go back to sleep. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, lying flat on my back, eyes wide open in the darkness. That's when I felt it again, a tap on my big toe. I kicked out, trying to catch whoever or whatever was there, but my foot met only empty air. Heart pounding, I leapt out of bed and ran to my brother's room. They were all fast asleep, exactly where they should be. There was no way they could have been in my room. I returned to my room, thoroughly checking every nook and cranny once again. Nothing. Exhausted and confused, I finally fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke to find my closet open yet again. The early morning sunlight was filtering through the blinds, and I noticed something I hadn't before. One or two of the blinds were swaying gently back and forth. There was no breeze, no open window to explain this movement. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach. When I saw my mom that morning, she immediately noticed something was off. She commented on how tired I looked, pointing out the dark circles under my eyes. I hesitated for a moment before confiding in her about the strange occurrences, the tapping on my foot, the TV turning off, and the constantly opening closet door. She gave me an odd look, caught between concern and disbelief. She suggested that maybe I shouldn't be watching TV so late and told my brothers to stop messing with me if it was them. But I could tell by the look in her eyes that she sensed there was more to the story. That night, determined to get some proper rest, I decided not to turn on the TV. I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. But my relief was short-lived. In the middle of the night, I felt something on my foot again. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but then I felt the blanket being gently lifted by my toes. It wasn't painful, but it was deliberate, as if something was trying to get my attention. This happened 3 times in quick succession. I kicked out, shouting in frustration and fear. I turned on the lights, my heart racing, struggling to catch my breath. The room was empty, but the closet door was cracked open once again. Tears of frustration welled up in my eyes. Was I going crazy? Was I imagining all of this? I tried to sleep with the lights on, but the heat became unbearable, forcing me to uncover myself. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. When morning came, I confided in my mom again. The concern on her face was evident, but she seemed at a loss for what to do. In an attempt to help, she asked one of my brothers to sleep in my room with me that night. Despite my earlier frustration with him, I was secretly relieved at the prospect of having someone else in the room. That night, my brother set up a makeshift bed on the floor. When he asked what was going on, I snapped at him, telling him to mind his own business. I regret that now. He was only trying to help, and I was too proud and scared to admit how frightened I really was. I woke up in the middle of the night to an unsettling silence. Looking down, I realized my brother was gone, no blankets, no pillows. He must have returned to his own room. I couldn't blame him, especially after how I treated him. As I lay there, eyes closed, trying to will myself back to sleep, I heard a familiar click followed by static. My eyes snapped open to see the TV had turned on by itself. The room was bathed in the flickering blue light of the screen. As I sat up, my gaze was drawn to the window, where one of the blinds was swaying slowly back and forth. The fear and frustration of the past few days finally overwhelmed me. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, my voice cracking as I whispered, "What is going on?" I was trying desperately not to cry out or panic, not wanting to wake my family. What happened next is something I've struggled to explain ever since. It sounds crazy, even to my own ears, but I swear it's true. As I sat there on my bed, I saw an old lady standing by my closet. The sight of her froze me solid. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. It felt like time itself had stopped. She appeared to be in her late 60s or early 70s, short in stature with long black hair that fell to her elbows. She wore a long white nightgown and was slightly hunched over. Her features were indistinct. I couldn't make out her face clearly. She wasn't transparent like you might expect a ghost to be, but she wasn't entirely solid either. Her skin had an odd quality to it, not decayed, but definitely not normal. Then, the most inexplicable thing happened. We began to communicate. It wasn't a verbal conversation, it was more like a telepathic connection. I found myself asking her, "What do you want from me?" Her response came not in words, but in a feeling, a thought that formed in my mind. "I'm scared. I don't know where I am." I asked her why she was talking to me, and again, the answer came as a thought. "I'm waiting for my son. He hasn't come to visit me. I have been waiting for him." Confused and terrified, I asked once more, "Why me?" Her response sent a chill through me. "My son is the oldest, and I talk to you because you are the oldest." The next thing I remember is blinking, the world seeming to move in slow motion. I looked towards the window and saw the blind swaying gently as the first light of dawn began to filter through. As if coming out of a trance, I suddenly found myself able to move again. I started to cry, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I ran to my parents' room, woke my mom, and told her everything that had happened. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my story or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, she said it was a spirit that had come to tell me something. I explained in detail what I had seen and what the old lady had said to me. It was a Saturday morning, and I was supposed to stay at a friend's house for the weekend. Despite what had happened, I decided to go, partly because I had already promised, and partly because I was desperate to get out of that house for a while. When I returned home on Sunday, my mom was waiting for me with a candle. She instructed me to pray for the spirit to go where she needed to go, to pray for her path back to where she belonged. My mom also advised me that if the spirit bothered me again, I should ask her to leave, explaining that this wasn't her house and she couldn't stay. I lit the candle next to my room and prayed as my mom had instructed. It made me feel a bit better, like I was taking some kind of action against this inexplicable situation. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Between my late work hours at the movie theater and preparing for high school graduation, I didn't have much time to dwell on what had happened. The incident seemed to have stopped, and I began to wonder if it had all been a product of stress and lack of sleep. Then, one day, my mom sat me down for a talk. She explained that she had been intrigued by something I had told her about the old lady and had decided to do some investigating. She had managed to contact the previous owners of our house. What she discovered sent chills down my spine. According to the previous owners, before we moved in, there had been a family living in the house. Specifically, a mother and daughter. The mother had occupied what was now my room. She had chosen it because it was closest to the bathroom and she needed a walker to get around. Tragically, the mother had fallen ill and been taken to the hospital, where she passed away. The most chilling detail of all? My mom told me that the mother had indeed been waiting for her son to visit her, but she had died before he had the chance to come. By this point, my entire family had heard the story. Most of them were skeptical, dismissing it as an overactive imagination or a series of coincidences. But my mom argued in my defense, pointing out that there was no way I could have known those details, especially about the woman having an eldest son. In the years since, many family members have asked me about La Villagita, the old lady, and my experiences. More often than not, I've changed the subject or simply refused to engage. I think they see it as an amusing ghost story, something to be shared over drinks or at family gatherings. But for me, it was anything but amusing. It was terrifying, confusing, and life-changing. To this day, I'm still scared when I think about what happened to me. This is the first time I've really spoken about it in detail since it occurred. I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what happened in that room, why that spirit chose to communicate with me, or what it all means. But I do know that it changed the way I view the world and the possibilities that exist beyond what we can see and touch. As I've grown older, I've come to appreciate the support my mom gave me during that time. While others doubted or dismissed my experiences, she listened, she believed, and she tried to help. Her acceptance and guidance were a lifeline during a time when I felt lost and afraid. I still think about the old lady sometimes, wondering if she ever found the peace she was looking for. I hope that wherever she is now, she's no longer waiting, no longer lost and confused. And while part of me hopes I never experience anything like that again. The desert night was pitch black as I drove along the lonely highway cutting through the Navajo Nation. The headlights of my beat-up pickup truck barely illuminated the road ahead, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. I'd been on the road for hours, having left my life in the city behind to take a job on a ranch deep in the heart of the reservation. As I navigated the winding roads, my mind wandered to the events that had led me here. I'd always felt like an outsider in the bustling urban world, never quite fitting in with the fast-paced lifestyle and constant noise. When I stumbled across an ad for a ranch hand position on the reservation, something inside me stirred. It felt like a call to return to my roots, to reconnect with the land and the traditions of my ancestors. The radio crackled with static, breaking the silence and jolting me back to the present. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station, but only caught fragments of words and music. Giving up, I switched it off and continued driving in silence. As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, I finally spotted the turnoff for the ranch. A weathered wooden sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the entrance to what would be my new home. I turned onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing and rattling as I made my way towards the main house. The ranch sprawled out before me, a collection of modest buildings surrounded by vast expanses of scrubland and distant mesas. As I pulled up to the house, an old man emerged from the front door, his face lined with years of sun and hard work. This, I assumed, must be Duncan, the ranch owner who had hired me over the phone. "You made it," he said gruffly as I stepped out of the truck. His eyes, sharp and alert despite his age, skinned me from head to toe. "Thought you might have changed your mind." I shook my head. "No, sir. I'm here to work." Duncan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Get your things inside. We start at sunrise." The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and adjustment to ranch life. Duncan proved to be a stern but fair boss, teaching me the ins and outs of managing the livestock and maintaining the property. The work was backbreaking, but I found a sense of satisfaction in it that I'd never experienced in my previous jobs. As I settled into life on the ranch, I began to notice things. Small things at first, shadows moving at the corner of my vision, whispers on the wind that didn't quite sound like the breeze. I chalked it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination, but as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, as Duncan and I sat on the porch after a long day's work, I finally worked up the courage to ask him about it. "Duncan," I began hesitantly, "have you ever seen anything strange out here?" The old man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might laugh it off or tell me I was being ridiculous. Instead, he took a long sip of his coffee and stared out at the darkening landscape. "This land," he said slowly, "it's old. Older than you or me, older than the reservation, older than the Navajo people themselves. It's got its own spirit, its own life force, you might say. And sometimes, that force makes itself known." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. "What do you mean?" Duncan turned to look at me, his expression grave. "I mean that there are things out there that most people don't believe in anymore. Things that our ancestors knew and respected. Things that we've forgotten, to our peril." Over the next few months, Duncan began to share more of the old stories with me. Tales of skinwalkers and other supernatural beings that were said to roam the reservation. At first, I listened with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. But as time went on, and as my own strange experiences continued, I found myself believing more and more. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything changed. Duncan and I had been out checking the fences on the far edge of the property, an area we didn't visit often. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, I felt a sudden unease settle over me. "Duncan," I said, my voice tight, "I think we should head back." The old man nodded, his own expression tense. "I feel it too. Let's go." We mounted our horses and began to ride back towards the ranch house. The shadows seemed to deepen around us, and an unnatural silence fell over the land. Even the usual evening sounds of insects and night birds were absent. Suddenly, my horse reared, nearly throwing me from the saddle. I managed to hold on, but as I looked up, my blood ran cold. There, standing in the path before us, was a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its head was that of a coyote, but with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. "Skinwalker," Duncan whispered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and awe. The creature tilted its head, regarding us with those eerie glowing eyes. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You do not belong here," it said, the words echoing in my mind rather than my ears. Duncan straightened in his saddle, his face set in determination. "We have as much right to this land as you do, spirit," he replied firmly. The skinwalker's mouth opened in what might have been a grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Do you?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. "Then prove it." What happened next was a blur of action and terror. The skinwalker lunged at us, moving with impossible speed. Our horses bolted, and it was all I could do to hang on as we raced back towards the ranch house. Behind us, I could hear the creature pursuing, its eerie howl echoing across the desert. Duncan was shouting something, but the wind whipped his words away before they could reach me. As we approached the ranch house, Duncan suddenly veered off towards an old barn I'd never paid much attention to before. He dismounted quickly, gesturing for me to do the same. "Inside," he yelled. "Quickly." I followed him into the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. Duncan rushed to a back corner, where he began moving aside bales of hay to reveal a trapdoor. "Down here," he said, pulling the door open. "It's our only chance." I didn't hesitate, descending the ladder into darkness. Duncan followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind us. In the pitch black, I heard him fumbling with something, and then a soft glow filled the space as he lit an old oil lamp. We were in a small, circular room, its walls covered in strange symbols and paintings. In the center stood a pedestal holding a bundle of herbs and feathers. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duncan moved to the pedestal, his movements quick and purposeful. "A sanctuary," he replied, "built by my grandfather and his grandfather before him. A place of protection against the things that roam the night." Above us, we could hear the skinwalker circling the barn, its claws scraping against the wood. Duncan began to chant in Navajo, his voice low and rhythmic. As he spoke, the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint light. The skinwalker's howls grew more frenzied, but they also seemed to be growing fainter, as if it was being driven away by some unseen force. Duncan's chanting continued, growing in intensity until, with a final, ear-splitting shriek, the creature fell silent. We waited in tense silence for what felt like hours before Duncan finally stopped chanting. He turned to me, his face etched with exhaustion. "It's gone," he said. "For now." As we emerged from the hidden room, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The world seemed different somehow, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. Duncan placed a hand on my shoulder. "Now you understand," he said softly. "This isn't just a job. It's a calling. We're not just ranchers here. We're guardians." In the days and weeks that followed, Duncan began to teach me in earnest. Not just about ranching, but about the old ways, the rituals and beliefs that had protected his people for generations. I learned about the delicate balance between our world and the spirit world, and the importance of maintaining that balance. As time passed, I found myself changing. The city boy who had arrived at the ranch months ago was gone, replaced by someone more attuned to the rhythms of the land and the whispers of the spirits. I began to see things more clearly, to sense the presence of the otherworldly beings that shared this land with us. There were more encounters over the years, of course. Not all as dramatic as that first night with the skinwalker, but each one a reminder of the responsibility we bore. We faced spirits both benevolent and malevolent, always striving to maintain the balance. Duncan grew older, and I took on more of the responsibilities of running the ranch and protecting our territory. When he finally passed, it was with the knowledge that he had passed on his legacy that the watch would continue. I've always been a light sleeper. The faintest noise can rouse me from the deepest slumber, so it wasn't surprising when I first sensed a presence in my room. It was a frigid winter night when a cool breeze brushed against my skin, stirring me awake. Initially, I dismissed it as a draft from the window, but as my eyes fluttered open, I saw him standing at the foot of my bed. The man was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. His presence was simultaneously comforting and unsettling. I tried to speak, to inquire about his identity and intentions, but my voice failed me. I could only watch in silence as he moved closer, a gentle smile playing on his lips. As days turned into weeks, the man began visiting me every night. Sometimes he would sit silently by my bedside, watching over me as I slept. Other times, he would stroke my hair and whisper soothing words in my ear. I gradually grew accustomed to his nightly visits, finding solace in his presence during those lonely hours of darkness. Despite his calming demeanor, an air of mystery surrounded the man. I could never quite shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. There were nights when he would vanish without a trace, leaving me to wonder if he had ever been real or if he was merely a figment of my imagination. One particular night, as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, the man appeared before me in a shimmering light. His ethereal form glowed with a soft radiance, casting a warm glow over the room. It was then that I realized he was not of this world, that he was something beyond human comprehension. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "I am a guardian of the night," he replied, his voice like a gentle breeze caressing my skin. "I watch over those who need me, guiding them through the darkness." His words left me both awestruck and terrified. What did he mean by guiding me through the darkness? Was there something lurking in the shadows that I was unaware of? As the nights passed, the man revealed more of himself to me. He shared stories of ancient times, of battles fought and victories won. He spoke of the secrets of the universe, of how the stars aligned and the planets danced in harmony. I listened intently, hanging onto his every word like a lost soul seeking redemption. But as much as I yearned to know him better, there was always a part of him that remained elusive. He would vanish into thin air without warning, leading me to question if he had ever been there at all. One night, as I lay in bed bathed in the glow of the moonlight, the man spoke to me in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "It is time for you to face your fears," he said, his eyes shining with an otherworldly light. "There is darkness within you that must be confronted, a shadow that threatens to consume you if left unchecked." A chill ran down my spine at his words. What darkness was he referring to? Was there a part of me that I was unaware of, lurking beneath the surface like a dormant volcano waiting to erupt? The man reached out a hand towards me, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I could feel the power surging through me, awakening something deep within my soul. "Do not be afraid," he whispered, his voice like a gentle caress. "Embrace the darkness within you, for only then can you truly be free." With those words, the man vanished into the night, leaving me to ponder his cryptic message. I lay in bed for hours, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions that I could not explain. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to the darkness like a moth to a flame. I delved into the deepest recesses of my mind, searching for the source of the shadow that the man had spoken of. And as I confronted my fears head-on, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me like a cleansing tide. I no longer feared the darkness within me, for I knew that it was a part of who I was. As I embraced my true self, I felt the man's presence fade away, his nightly visits coming to an end. But I will always remember the man who visited me every night, the guardian of the night who showed me the true meaning of courage and self-discovery. And as I drift off to sleep each night, I know that he will always be watching over me from the shadows, guiding me through the darkness with a gentle hand and a kind heart. The experience with the mysterious nightly visitor left an indelible mark on my life. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself grappling with the implications of what had transpired. The line between reality and imagination became increasingly blurred, and I often caught myself questioning my own sanity. I began to pay more attention to the world around me, noticing details that I had previously overlooked. The way shadows danced on the walls, the whispers of the wind through the trees, the subtle shifts in the air that seemed to herald the approach of something unseen, all of these took on new significance in light of my nocturnal encounters. My friends and family noticed the change in me. They commented on my newfound introspection, the way I seemed to be constantly lost in thought. I couldn't bring myself to share the truth with them. How could I explain the nightly visits from a mysterious guardian, the cryptic messages about facing my inner darkness? I knew they would think I had lost my mind. Instead, I threw myself into research. I spent countless hours in libraries, poring over ancient texts and obscure manuscripts. I delved into mythology, psychology, and philosophy, searching for any clues that might help me make sense of what I had experienced. I became particularly fascinated with Jungian psychology and the concept of the shadow self, the hidden aspects of our personality that we often repress or deny. As I explored these ideas, I began to understand what the mysterious man had meant about confronting the darkness within me. We all have aspects of ourselves that we're afraid to face, our fears, our insecurities, our deepest desires. By acknowledging and integrating these shadow elements, we can achieve a greater sense of wholeness and self-acceptance. This realization led me on a journey of intense self-reflection. I started keeping a dream journal, recording every detail I could remember upon waking. I practiced meditation, learning to quiet my mind and listen to the whispers of my subconscious. I even sought out a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the complex landscape of my psyche. Through this process, I uncovered parts of myself that I had long buried or ignored. I confronted childhood traumas, faced long-held fears, and acknowledged desires that I had been too ashamed to admit even to myself. It was a painful and often frightening journey, but with each step, I felt myself growing stronger, more whole. As I delved deeper into my inner world, I began to notice subtle changes in my outer reality as well. The world seemed to take on a new vibrancy, colors appearing more vivid, sounds more crisp. I found myself more attuned to the emotions of those around me, picking up on subtle cues that I had previously missed. There were moments when I thought I caught glimpses of the mysterious man out of the corner of my eye, a tall figure disappearing around a corner, a fleeting reflection in a window. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. These occurrences left me with a mix of excitement and unease, a reminder that there was still so much about my experience that I didn't understand. One night, about a year after the visits had stopped, I had a vivid dream. In it, I found myself standing on the edge of a vast, dark forest. The mysterious man stood beside me, his blue eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "You have come far," he said, his voice carrying on the night breeze. "But your journey is not yet complete." He gestured towards the forest, and I felt a pull, an inexorable urge to step into the darkness. As I took my first step, I felt his hand on my shoulder. "Remember," he said, "the darkness is not to be feared, but understood. It is a part of you, as much as the light." With those words, I plunged into the forest. The dream that followed was a kaleidoscope of images and sensations, running through dark woods, confronting shadowy figures, discovering hidden clearings bathed in moonlight. When I awoke, I felt as though I had lived a lifetime in that dream world. The dream stayed with me, its imagery and emotions lingering long after I had opened my eyes. I realized that my journey of self-discovery was far from over. The mysterious man, whether he was a real entity, a manifestation of my subconscious, or something in between, had set me on a path that would likely last a lifetime. In the years that followed, I continued to explore the depths of my psyche. I sought out new experiences, pushing myself out of my comfort zone and embracing the unknown. I traveled to far-flung corners of the world, immersing myself in different cultures and ways of thinking. I tried my hand at various forms of artistic expression, painting, writing, music, finding new ways to give voice to the parts of myself that I was still discovering. Through it all, I never forgot the lessons I had learned from my nightly visitor. I learned to embrace the duality within myself, the light and the dark, the known and the unknown. I came to understand that true strength comes not from denying our shadows, but from integrating them into our whole selves. As I sit here now, years later, I can look back on that strange period of my life with a sense of gratitude. The mysterious man who visited me in the night set me on a path of self-discovery that has enriched my life in ways I could never have imagined. He taught me to look beyond the surface, to question my assumptions, and to find beauty and meaning in the darkest corners of existence. I still have nights when I lie awake, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see a tall figure materialize at the foot of my bed. And while those visitations have long since ceased, I carry with me the knowledge that there is more to this world, and to ourselves, than meets the eye. The darkness no longer frightens me. Instead, it intrigues me, challenges me, invites me to explore its depths. For I know now that it is in facing our shadows that we truly come to know ourselves. And in that knowledge lies a power and a freedom that I never could have imagined before that first fateful night when a stranger appeared in my room. Life has a funny way of changing course when you least expect it. For me, that change came on a lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night. But to understand how I ended up there, we need to go back a bit. My name is Jack Miller. Up until 3 months ago, I was living what most would consider a perfectly ordinary life in Seattle. I had a steady job as a software developer at a mid-sized tech company, a comfortable apartment downtown, and a small but close group of friends. My days were filled with code, coffee, and the occasional weekend hike in the nearby mountains. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and I thought I was content. Then came the layoffs. Our company had been struggling, but none of us expected the sudden announcement that half the workforce would be let go. I was among them. Just like that, the stability I had taken for granted was gone. The next few weeks were a blur of job applications, rejected interviews, and mounting bills. The tech industry in Seattle was saturated, and competition for jobs was fierce. It was during this time that I received a call from my sister, Emma. She was getting married in Florida and wanted me to be there. Under normal circumstances, I would have booked a flight without hesitation. But with my savings dwindling and no job prospects in sight, the cost of airfare seemed like an unnecessary luxury. That's when the idea hit me. Why not drive? I had time on my hands, and the thought of a cross-country road trip held a certain appeal. It would be cheaper than flying, and maybe the change of scenery would help clear my head, give me a new perspective on things. I spent the next week preparing for the journey. I tuned up my old Honda Civic, packed a duffel bag with clothes, and loaded up my laptop with audiobooks and podcasts to keep me company on the long drive. As I plotted my route on a map, I felt a spark of excitement for the first time in months. This wasn't just a trip to a wedding, it was an adventure, a chance to see parts of the country I'd only ever flown over. The first few days of the drive were everything I'd hoped for. I cruised through the lush forests of Oregon, marveled at the stark beauty of the Utah desert, and found myself humming along to country music as I passed through small towns in Colorado. I stopped at quirky roadside attractions, ate at greasy spoon diners, and spent nights in cheap motels with flickering neon signs. For the first time since losing my job, I felt free. The open road stretched out before me, full of possibilities. I even started to toy with the idea of not returning to Seattle after the wedding. Maybe I'd find a job in a smaller town, somewhere with a lower cost of living. Or perhaps I'd freelance, working remotely from wherever I felt like settling for a while. But as I crossed into the Midwest, the novelty of the trip began to wear off. The landscapes became flatter, the towns more spread out. I found myself driving for hours without seeing another car, the monotony broken only by the occasional truck stop or gas station. It was on the fourth night of my journey that things took a turn. I had been pushing myself hard, trying to make good time. I wanted to arrive in Florida with a day or two to spare before the wedding to help Emma with any last-minute preparations. I had been on the road for nearly 16 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and energy drinks. The sun had long since set, and I was somewhere in the middle of Kansas. The highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon cutting through endless fields. My eyelids felt heavy, and I was considering pulling over at the next rest stop to catch a few hours of sleep. That's when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. They appeared suddenly, as if the vehicle had materialized out of thin air. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another traveler on this lonely stretch of road, probably as eager as I was to reach their destination. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized something wasn't right. The vehicle behind me, a large truck, from what I could make out in the darkness, was getting closer. Much closer than was comfortable or safe. I tapped my brakes, hoping the driver would take the hint and back off. Instead, the truck surged forward, its grille now filling my rearview mirror. My heart began to race. What was this guy's problem? I pressed down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. But no matter how fast I went, the truck stayed right on my tail, its headlights blazing. That's when the real fear set in. This wasn't just an impatient driver or someone not paying attention. This was deliberate. But why? What did this person want? My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop and made a split-second decision. I'd pull in there, where there might be other people around. Safety in numbers, right? As I took the exit, the truck followed. I cursed under my breath, hands shaking as I navigated the dark, twisting road leading to the rest area. The parking lot came into view, illuminated by a single flickering street light. My heart sank. It was empty. Not a single car or person in sight. The isolation that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt oppressive and threatening. I pulled into a spot near the restroom building, killing the engine. The truck's headlights flooded my rearview mirror, blinding me. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding in my ears. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. Seconds ticked by, each feeling like an eternity. I could hear the low rumble of the truck's engine, a menacing growl in the silence of the night. And then, suddenly, silence. The light behind me vanished. Slowly, I opened my eyes and turned around. The parking lot was empty. No truck, no headlights, nothing but darkness and the faint buzz of the streetlight above. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I so exhausted that I hallucinated a threatening truck? Eventually, I gathered the courage to step out of my car. The cool night air hit my face, helping to clear my head. I walked a lap around the parking lot, half expecting the truck to reappear at any moment. but there was no sign it had ever been there. No tire tracks, no lingering exhaust fumes, nothing. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion crept back in. I decided to try to get some sleep in my car before continuing my journey. I reclined the seat and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, certain I heard the rumble of an engine or seen a flash of headlights. The sky was just beginning to lighten when I gave up on sleep. I needed coffee if I was going to make it the rest of the way home. I started the car and pulled out of the rest stop, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the truck. The highway was still eerily empty as I merged back onto it. My nerves were shot, and every vehicle I saw in the distance made my heart rate spike. But none of them were the truck that had chased me. About an hour later, I spotted a 24-hour diner just off the highway. The parking lot was half full, a welcome sight after the emptiness of the night. I pulled in, desperate for caffeine and human contact. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the sound almost startling in its normalcy. A few heads turned to look at me, then went back to their own conversations or plates of food. I slid into a booth near the window, still able to keep an eye on my car and the highway beyond. A waitress approached, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read Betty, and she had the weary but kind look of someone who'd seen it all on the night shift. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing my disheveled appearance as she filled my cup. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "You could say that. Had a bit of a scare on the highway." She raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh, what happened?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. How could I explain what I'd experienced without sounding crazy? But something in Betty's expression told me she might understand. "There was this truck," I began, my voice low. "It followed me for miles, riding my bumper. No matter how fast I went or which lane I took, it stayed right behind me. When I pulled over at a rest stop, it just vanished." I expected her to laugh it off or give me a patronizing smile, but instead, Betty's expression changed. A flicker of recognition passed through her eyes. She glanced around the diner, then leaned in closer. "You're not the first to come through here with a story like that," she said in a low voice. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Betty sighed, sliding into the seat across from me. She looked tired, but there was an intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "In the past few months, we've had a handful of drivers stop in here, all shaken up about a truck that chased them on the highway. Always at night, always on that same stretch you came in on." I leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "Did they see who was driving it?" She shook her head, a grim expression on her face. "That's the thing, no one ever sees a driver. And the truck always disappears without a trace. It's like it's not quite real, you know?" A chill ran down my spine. What do you think it means?" Betty shrugged, but her eyes were serious. "I don't know, but there's been a string of robberies on that highway lately. Cars found abandoned, drivers missing. Police haven't been able to catch whoever's behind it." My mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. A phantom truck, disappearing drivers, unsolved robberies. It was like something out of a nightmare. "Has anyone reported this truck to the police?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Betty nodded, a hint of frustration in her voice. "A few have tried, but without any evidence, and with the truck always vanishing, well, let's just say the police aren't taking it too seriously. They think it's just tired drivers seeing things, or maybe some local kids playing pranks." I sat back, processing this information. Part of me felt relieved that I wasn't the only one who had experienced this, that I wasn't going crazy. But a larger part was terrified. What was really going on out there on that lonely stretch of highway? Betty must have seen the fear in my eyes. She reached out and patted my hand, her touch surprisingly comforting. "Look, you made it here safe. That's what matters. My advice? Stick to driving during the day if you can. And if you see that truck again, get somewhere public as fast as you can. Don't try to outrun it, don't pull over in the middle of nowhere. Just find people, lots of people." I nodded, grateful for her kindness and the warning. As she stood to get back to work, a thought occurred to me. "Wait," I called after her. "You said there have been robberies, missing drivers, but I wasn't robbed." The truck didn't even stop when I pulled over. "Why?" Betty turned back, and the grim expression on her face sent a new wave of fear through me. "Maybe you got lucky," she said slowly. "Or maybe they were just scouting, learning your habits, your reactions. For next time." With that chilling thought, she walked away, leaving me alone with my cooling coffee and racing thoughts. I stayed at the diner far longer than I planned, nursing cup after cup of coffee as I watched the sun rise fully. The normalcy of the morning rush helped ground me, reminding me that the world wasn't all dark highways and phantom trucks. When I finally got back on the road, I felt more in control. The highways looked different in the daylight, less menacing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That somewhere out there, the driver of that ghost truck was waiting for another opportunity. I made it to Emma's wedding without further incident, but the experience stayed with me. In the days that followed, I found myself jumpy and distracted. Every unexpected noise made me flinch, and I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of endless highways and pursuing headlights. After the wedding, I decided to fly back to Seattle instead of driving. The thought of facing that highway again was too much to bear. But even back in the familiar surroundings of my apartment, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I found myself researching highway robberies in the area, looking for patterns or clues. The more I dug, the more unsettling stories I uncovered. Reports of vehicles found abandoned, their drivers vanished without a trace. Whispered accounts of a truck that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. I even considered reporting my experience to the police, but always stopped short. What could I tell them that wouldn't sound completely insane? "Officer, I was chased by a ghost truck that vanished into thin air." I could almost hear the skepticism in their voices. Weeks passed, and slowly, the intensity of that night began to fade. I still avoided driving long distances at night, but the constant fear subsided. Life went on. I eventually found a new job, threw myself into work, trying to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind. Then, about a month after my encounter, I saw a news report that made my blood run cold. A car had been found abandoned on that same highway, the driver missing. The details were eerily similar to the stories Betty had told me at the diner. As I stared at the TV screen, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder, had I really escaped that night, or had I just postponed the inevitable? The image of the abandoned car on the news seemed to mock me, a grim reminder of what could have been, what might still be waiting for me out there. The highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the night, but now, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me flinch. Every truck that passed sent my heart racing. The once peaceful solitude of a late-night drive had been shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. I found myself avoiding long drives, making excuses to stay close to home. When I did have to travel, I meticulously planned my routes to stick to busy, well-lit roads. I installed a dash cam in my car, hoping that if I ever encountered the phantom truck again, I'd at least have some evidence. But even as I took these precautions, a part of me knew they might be futile. If what I'd experienced was something beyond the ordinary, would any of this really make a difference? I knew one thing for certain, I would never look at an empty highway the same way again. Because now I knew that sometimes, in the dead of night, those highways aren't as empty as they seem. And the things that lurk in the darkness don't always disappear when you turn to face them. As time passed, the memory of that night remained vivid, a constant reminder of the inexplicable and the dangerous. I often found myself wondering about the other drivers who had encountered the phantom truck. What had become of them? Had they managed to move on with their lives, or were they, like me, forever changed by their experience? And what of the missing drivers? Were they victims of ordinary crime, or was there something more sinister at play? The questions haunted me, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. In the end, all I could do was stay vigilant, always watching the rearview mirror, always wary of the shadows on the road. Because out there, somewhere in the night, I knew the phantom truck was still roaming. Waiting. Watching. Ready to emerge from the darkness once again. Being a game warden up in the backcountry isn't just a job for me. It's my life. I've been patrolling these woods for nearly 15 years, so you could say I know them like the back of my hand. Most days it's the same old routine, helping hikers, tracking wildlife, and keeping the peace between nature and the folks who come to enjoy it. I'm used to the calls about bears wandering into camps or the eerie screams of mountain lions in the night. To me, that's just the sound of nature doing its thing. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last month. It all started with a phone call from a day hiker. I could tell right off the bat that this wasn't your typical call. The guy was out of breath, his voice shaking with fear as he told me about the blood-curdling screams he heard while hiking out at sunset. Now I've heard cougar screams before. They can sound pretty demonic. But this was different. There was something in the hiker's voice, a kind of terror you can't fake, that got my attention. Over the next few days our dispatch got flooded with calls. Hikers were reporting the same thing, bone-chilling wails echoing through the trees at dusk near Malin Peak. The reports were coming in by the dozen, and each caller sounded more terrified than the last. As the senior guy, it fell on me to check it out. I've faced down bears and tranquilized rogue elk, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit rattled by the sheer number of calls we were getting. So I decided to head up to the trailhead, near Malin Peak myself. I timed my arrival for sunset, just like the reports had said. The drive up was uneventful, but as soon as I got out of the truck and grabbed my gear, I could feel that something was off. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. It's hard to explain, but when you spend as much time in the forest as I have, you get to know the sounds. The rustle of leaves, the chatter of birds, the scurrying of small animals. But that evening, there was none of that. It was like even the animals were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I started up the path, the silence weighing heavy around me. The further I went, the more I felt like something was watching me, following my every step. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the nerves talking, but it was no use. About a mile in, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. Weird piles of branches and twigs, all arranged in patterns on the ground. They were too neat, too precise to be natural. It looked almost like some kind of ritual thing. I've seen a lot in my years as a game warden, but this was new. I reached for my radio to call it in, but all I got back was static, and that's when I noticed my compass going haywire. I've used the compass more times than I can count, and I've never seen it act like that. It just spun randomly, no matter which way I turned. I looked up, realizing the light was fading fast, way faster than it should have been. The sky turned a bruised purple, and that's when I knew, whatever was happening here, it was nothing I'd ever dealt with before. With each step I took deeper into the woods, the sense of unease grew stronger. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I tried to focus on the mission at hand, to figure out the source of those eerie calls that had scared the daylights out of so many hikers. But as the silence stretched on, my own fears started to creep in. The backcountry, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt foreign and threatening. I was about a mile in when I stumbled upon the first pile of branches and twigs. It was arranged so precisely on the ground that it couldn't have been the work of nature. I've seen some odd things left by hikers or local kids trying to spook each other, but this was different. It looked intentional, like a symbol or a message, though I couldn't begin to guess what it meant. My mind raced with possibilities. Were people using this remote part of the forest for some kind of ritual? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. As I reported my find over the radio, all I got back was static. That's when I noticed my compass acting up. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle in any direction. I've relied on that compass more times than I can count, and to see it fail so completely was unnerving. It was as if the very laws of nature were being twisted, leaving me disoriented in a forest that had always been my second home. Then as the light began to fade, the forest took on an eerie glow. The sky, a deep bruised purple, seemed to press down on me. I hurried to a clearing, hoping to get a better look at the sky, but what I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. Hovering above the trees was a massive disc-shaped object. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its surface glinting with an almost liquid silver sheen. The setting sun cast strange reflections off its surface, making it seem like it was pulsating with light. It made no sound, which somehow made it even more terrifying. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at this UFO. It was like something straight out of the movies, yet here it was, floating in the sky above me. But the true horror lay on the ground beneath the hovering ship. Lined up evenly were 5 mountain lions, their bodies open with surgical precision. It was a gruesome sight. Their organs removed so cleanly that there was no blood, no mess. It looked like the work of a skilled surgeon, not any predator known to these woods. The sight of those mountain lions, so violently altered, filled me with a dread unlike any I'd felt before. Wild animals simply don't operate with such precision. This was something else, something far beyond my understanding. As I took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing, a blinding white light poured down from the ship. It was so intense, so pure, that I couldn't see anything else. It felt like it was burning right through me, leaving nothing but pain in its wake. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down in the dirt, just outside the ring of those sacrificed animals. I was disoriented, my body aching as if I'd been through a ringer. Pulling myself up, I realized I had to get back to the trailhead, no matter how. The forest, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap closing in around me. Waking up on the forest floor was a shock. My head was pounding and my body felt like I'd just run a marathon, then got hit by a truck at the finish line. For a few moments I just lay there, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the blinding light coming from that thing in the sky. Everything after that was a blur. As I slowly got to my feet, everything felt wrong. My skin burned, and when I looked down, I saw angry red patches across my arms and face. And there were marks too. Strange circular marks that looked almost like crop circles. It was like something out of one of those alien movies, except it was on my skin, and it was real. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. What had happened to me? Stumbling through the forest, I made my way back to the trailhead, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. Every step was a struggle, my body screaming in protest, but I had to get back. I had to find help. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, my boss took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. Without a word, he drove me straight to the ER. The doctors ran all sorts of tests. MRI, CT scans, blood tests. But they couldn't find anything. They couldn't explain the burns, the marks, or why I felt so weak. They suggested it might be some form of electrocution, but nothing added up. It was as if whatever had happened to me was beyond their understanding. Back at work, things were different. My colleagues looked at me with a mix of concern and suspicion. Whispers of PTSD and losing it followed me around like a shadow. I tried to tell them what I saw, what I experienced, but it was clear they thought I was just rattled from being out in the woods alone. But I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Determined to find some answers, I led a team back to the site where it all happened. But when we got there, there was nothing. No ship, no marks, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed up all evidence of that night. We did find 2 of the mountain lion corpses, but the others were gone, vanished without a trace. The investigation turned up nothing conclusive. My story, backed by the physical evidence of my burns and the dead mountain lions, was met with skepticism and disbelief. The case was chalked up to unknown causes. Unofficially, I knew people thought I had cracked under the pressure. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling of what I had experienced. The memory of the ship, the light, the pain, it was all too vivid, too real to be dismissed as a hallucination. But with no proof and no one willing to believe me, I was left to question my own sanity. The whispers, the looks, the isolation, it all weighed on me. But I knew I couldn't let it break me. I had faced something unimaginable, something beyond this world, and I had survived. Whatever others thought, I knew the truth. And somehow, that had to be enough. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers at work never really stopped. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my job and pretend everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blinding light from the UFO, felt the heat scorching my skin. The nightmares were relentless, vivid replays of that night that left me waking up in cold sweats, heart pounding out of my chest. I became a bit of a loner, spending my lunch breaks by myself, avoiding the curious stares and hushed conversations of my colleagues. It wasn't just the physical scars that isolated me. It was the knowledge of what I had seen, what I had experienced. It set me apart in a way that was hard to bridge. The investigation into the strange occurrences in the forest was officially closed, marked as unexplained. But for me, there were still so many questions. Why me? What was that ship? Why did it leave those marks on my skin? And why did it kill those mountain lions with such precision? The lack of answers was maddening. A constant itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. I tried talking to my family about it, hoping for some semblance of understanding or at least a comforting word. But I could see the doubt in their eyes, the underlying question of whether I had imagined the whole thing. It hurt, feeling so alienated from the people I loved, but I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't lived it, I'm not sure I would have believed it either. As the months passed, I found a sort of routine in my new reality. The scars on my skin faded into pale lines, but the marks remained, a constant reminder of that night. I started seeing a therapist, someone who didn't dismiss my experience outright, who listened and tried to help me make sense of it all. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. One day, while patrolling the same area where it all happened, I stopped in the clearing where I had seen the UFO. It looked just like any other part of the forest, peaceful and unremarkable. Standing there, I realized that I would never get the answers I was looking for. Whatever had visited that night was gone, leaving no trace behind but the impact it had on my life. I had to accept that some things are beyond our understanding, beyond our control. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, but it was necessary. I learned to live with the memories, with the nightmares. They became a part of me, a testament to my strength, my survival. In the end, I found a sort of peace. Not because the questions had been answered, but because I had learned to live with the unknown. The experience had changed me, shaped me into someone new. I was no longer just a game warden. I was a survivor of something extraordinary, something otherworldly. And maybe that was enough. Maybe in the vast, unexplained universe, my story was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle I was okay with not completing.